wanted to start with bringing up this, what I think is like a very mind-blowing statistic. I found this in Indian Express did an analysis of CMI's employment data like a couple of months back. And I'm sure you are aware of this, but I don't know how many people who are watching are aware of this. So in 2016, according to CMI, the total number of people who were employed in the country was 41.2 crore. And 5 years later, in December 2021, that number apparently has come down to 40.4 crore. So that's like the number of people employed is less today than it was 5 years ago. And at the same time, as you know, that like around 10 to 12 crore people have joined the working age population. Now, that seems like a very disturbing thing to happen to any economy. Is that, how alarming is that? And how the hell did we get here?
Right. Okay, so let's break it down into two parts. One is the fact of the decline in workforce that you mentioned, and the other is how do we arrive at these numbers in the first place, because that also has to be looked at. Right? So just for your viewers' background, typically we have sample surveys, whether the NSSO for the government of India does it or the CMI does it. These are large scale exercises that tell us how participation in work is going at the household level, right, or at every period of time. For CMI it's every few months, for NSSO it's every few years, and so PLFS does it annually. Now a lot of the devil here is in the details of how do you ask questions to people about what they are doing, right? Because it's a survey. So it becomes clearest for women, for example, where there's been a lot of debate over women's labor force participation. And a lot of the decline that we saw, even before 2016, came from women not participating. So, and there, how you ask the question becomes very important, because many times women themselves, as well as people around them, see them as homemakers primarily. So even if they are active participants in employment, that doesn't get recorded. So these problems occur. Now, that's important to keep in mind, because the government's way of measuring employment and the CMI's way of measuring employment are different.
Of course.
So it makes it comparisons difficult. Now, having said that, to come to the fact that you started with, the one big factor there, of course, is COVID, because COVID was a massive disruption to our economy. So the years 2020 and 2021, lot of people lost work, came back to work, lost it again in the waves of the pandemic. So if we compare 2016 to just before the pandemic, we might get a slightly different picture from comparing, let's say, during the pandemic to 2016. The government data tells us that between 2017 and 2019, in fact, labor force participation increased somewhat. CMI, I think, says that it's either the same or slightly decreased. Here's where the measurement issues come in. Now, regardless of all the details, which we don't need to get lost in, I think the big picture to note here is that India does have a problem of job creation for, as you said, for the entering youth. And in particular, it has a problem both in terms of getting older women to continue into work after they get married and finding work for younger women. Both of these are separate challenges that we have.
The employment story that, as far as I am aware of, if you go back, like take a little bit more picture and zoom out a little bit more, what even like reading the State of Working India reports that you've obviously worked on a lot, there seems to be like you could divide it into two phases. The boom phase of 2004-2005 till 2011-12, and then there's this sort of stagnation begins. And like you said, there's a little bit of a jump between, around 2017-18 when it gets cut short. What changed in that? What is the difference in these two phases that allowed a lot of the labor that was leaving agriculture to get absorbed in construction, etc., which did not happen in the 2010s?
Correct. That's exactly right. So there's many things that are different about these two periods that you mentioned. You're absolutely correct that in the first decade of the 2000s, we saw a large movement of people away from agriculture, and they mainly went into construction, not manufacturing, which is where ideally we would have liked to see them go. That's a different aspect. However, starting with the financial crisis of 2008, the global financial crisis, and then
Yeah.
the after effects. At that time, India didn't feel it much, but
Yeah.
2010 onwards, those effects were felt. And then more particularly, the 12-13 crisis that India had with the foreign exchange rate and so forth, the taper tantrum, so called.
Yeah.
That marks the shift to a different type of a macroeconomic environment.
True.
At the same time, connectedly, the boom of the first decade created all this legacy problem of the NPAs, or the non-performing assets, in the banking system. So what you see after 2013, 12-13 is a scaling back of credit. Construction is hit quite badly. In fact, it
Sure.
slows down.
Yeah.
So employment opportunities there slow down, and banks are generally much more reluctant to lend. Uh, that's what's happening in the aftermath of that 12-13 crisis. And before a recovery can happen, demonetization happens in 2016, followed by the
Yeah.
GST rollout in 2017. So we've got a decade of multiple shocks occurring at frequent intervals, which have not allowed the growth momentum to be sustained, nor jobs to be created. I mean, these are, of course, growth can happen even without jobs, as we
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
But in the last few decades, last few years, even growth started slowing down.
Yeah.
And the increase in labor participation that I referred to between 17 and 19, it need not be a good sign. See, if it happens
Okay.
during a slowdown, it can actually be distress-led increase of participation. So, for example, women may choose to participate in greater numbers not because good employment opportunities are being created, but rather because
Yeah.
conditions at home are worse enough that now, so to speak, even they have to go out to work, right? The norms
Okay.
being what they are,
Yeah.
that happens. So that kind of labor participation increase can also, it did happen in fact in 1819.
Okay.
Because otherwise it's very hard to explain why during an economic slowdown you should have a healthy labor market.
Yeah.
That usually doesn't happen. So these are the two kind of different periods that we have seen in recent history.
Coming back to that question about female labor force participation, it's been like the big question everybody is talking about, and you also, like, some of it has to maybe do with the surveys, the questions, how people perceive. What is the, like, if we can talk about some specific reasons why this is happening, and if the scale of the problem is as big as the numbers sometimes suggest, like, what is going on there?
Right. Yes, the scale is certainly large. So just to quickly recap the numbers,
Yeah.
the overall labor participation rate for women, according to government periodic labor force survey data, is somewhere around 20%, which means that 1 out of 5 women report being in paid work. Okay? And this
Yeah.
is any kind of paid work. It could be self-employment, casual work, regular wage work.
Got it.
According to the CMI, that number is even lower than 20%, somewhere
Okay.
around 15 or
Okay.
10.
Okay.
However, when people do other smaller surveys that try to be more mindful of women's work, the fact that it is informal, the fact that it
Yeah.
is irregular, the fact that it is part time, the fact that people may not report it, if
Yeah.
you try to be more careful about it, then the female LFPR can go as high as 40%
Okay.
in other surveys. So
Okay.
that tells you that the measurement issue is not an insignificant issue.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
It is an issue. But the measurement issue also points to a more fundamental issue of the quality of work itself. And that's where the problem is big. If a person is in full time, productive, paid employment, it's very unlikely that they will get missed. Then the measurement is not so sensitive to the way you ask questions, because to me, anybody asks a question, I will be employed because I have a full-time paying job, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's when those jobs become irregular, informal, etc., is when the
Yeah.
catching becomes hard. So what this points to is that women tend to work in a way that is invisible, whether it is inside the home, whether it is part-time, etc. So the policy challenge is to bring women out of the home into regular paid employment. And that's a big challenge. We're talking about the majority of women
Yeah.
not doing that,
Yeah.
while the majority of men do that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, moving India to a society where, alongside men, the majority of women are out of the home
True.
doing paid work
True.
is where we need to be moving.
The thing with female LFPR that I noticed was that it wasn't this low before. So again, with that, the what we're talking about, the two phases, it seems like it was a little bit higher. It was obviously not ideally high as, in other countries as it might be. It went down. And like even if we talk about the same surveys and stuff, like what again? Something happened there that women just kind of slowly
Yeah.
withdrew. Was there? Do
Right.
we know what happened?
Yes, we have some understanding. There has been quite a bit of work actually on this,
Yeah,
and it appears to be mainly a rural phenomenon, the withdrawal.
yeah, 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 yeah.
In urban India, it has been sort of low and stagnant. In rural
Uh,
India, it fell,
it fell.
particularly between 2004, 5, and 11, 12, the two NSS rounds.
Yeah.
You see a decline. Now, and that happens to be largely in agriculture. So it looks like women who were doing work in agriculture withdrew.
Okay.
There are two stories for why this withdrawal happened.
Yeah.
One is that there was a displacement due to mechanization and so forth,
Yeah.
meaning adoption of machinery on farms and so on.
Yeah.
Men continued to do what they were doing on the farm and took over work that were earlier labor intensive work for women, now became mechanized work that men were doing, while women stopped doing that work. That's one story. The other is that an increase in incomes that came with moving into non farm jobs, construction, other kinds of jobs, meant that women were no longer required, so to speak. Again, norms being what they are,
Okay.
since women's employment is often seen as a do you need to do that work for the
Yeah.
family or not?
Yeah.
Once they were seen as not needing that work, they withdrew.
Yeah.
That's
Okay.
that's an increase in income story. So there are both of these stories out there: displacement due to mechanization as well as increase in incomes that caused a withdrawal of women from agriculture. The point again here to note, the larger point is not that it's a bad thing that they are withdrawing from agriculture. The bad thing is that they are not substituting it with other forms of paid employment, which is where the policy challenge comes in. That are we creating work for women? And what we do know again from surveys is that women's LFPR being low doesn't mean that they don't want to work. It just means that they are not actively searching for employment,
Yeah.
perhaps because they don't think that they will find something. But if work was to be there, they would probably do it. And there's some very interesting recent work about whether norms are actually preventing women at this point, or is it just lack of work?
Yeah. Yeah.
That
Yeah.
is,
It's a very difficult thing to suss out, which is okay. We're talking about LFPR. I just wanted to just for the sake of the audience, the labor force participation rate is the total number of people that are out there looking for work and are either employed or out there looking for work. And even that number, not just the total number of employed people, even the LFPR has been coming down. And again, there's this idea that obviously the number of people who are young people who are in education and all that stuff, that has obviously increased. So one can expect like a little bit of fall in that. I always wanted to ask this, that apart from those people, young people who are in the educational institutions, if people are choosing to not actively seek work, and we don't have like in like some other countries, we don't have like unemployment insurance, so people can't just sit at home and wait for what happens to how are these the people who have sat out of the labor force, how are they surviving? Are they just relying on other family members? What is like, how are they making any kind of progress?
right. So here, of course, the distinction between men and women is very important, and age is very important in addition to the level of education. One related fact to keep in mind is unemployment as opposed to being out of the labor force. So for your viewers, again, there's a distinction
Yeah.
between, as you said, looking for work, wanting to work, versus just not wanting to do that. Right? Unemployment in India is mainly limited to educated young people.
Yeah.
These are people who have more than 12 years of education, diplomas, degrees,
Yeah. Yeah.
and they're in their 20s, men and women.
Yeah.
Right? The rate is very high for them.
Yeah.
Moment you cross 30 years of age, the rate decreases, unemployment rate decreases. Right?
Yeah.
People find something to do.
Yeah. Yeah.
As you're saying, they cannot remain unemployed forever.
Yeah. Yeah.
They cannot depend on other people forever. So they find something to do. Whether that is appropriate to their degree or aspirations, that's a different question.
True.
Women often get married.
Yeah.
So in that case, there's a big transition in their life. Now they are homemakers and they are out of the labor force. So they're no longer unemployed.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Because they're not even looking for work.
Yeah.
That's the kind of phenomenon that goes on. But people don't really remain out of the labor force and completely dependent on other people for long periods of
Long
time.
period. Okay.
They either find something to do or they become involved in unpaid work at home, like domestic activities.
Sure.
If they generally if they're women.
Okay. Okay. You mentioned this thing about this idea that, like, yeah, the highest unemployment rates are among young people, and it's like this kind of a situation must have some like serious social impacts when, like a large number of young people who, like you said, are like have maybe some diploma, maybe some engineering degree or something, some degree, and like this whole phenomenon of like lakhs of people applying for like 500 jobs in the railways and whatever.
Yeah.
Like what kind of like this, if we are unable to deal with this problem of job creation, especially for young people, what kind of like social impacts do you think that this can have on a society as at large?
Yeah, I think it can have significant negative effects, and we have seen this in other countries. Of course, India is a much larger country than many of the,
Yeah.
for example, the Arab Spring countries,
Oh
where the
yeah.
unemployed young people were very important in
Yeah.
driving those regime changes. Those countries are much smaller. But nevertheless, even in a country like India, this extended spells of being out of work,
Yeah.
unemployed, taking competitive exams, or applying for government jobs, all of these take a toll on people's psychology, their self-worth, and that has a wider implication for the families that they are in as
True.
well. So there are two sort of aspects to it. One is, why are lakhs and lakhs of people applying for so few government jobs?
Yeah.
What are they hoping to achieve? What are their aspirations, and so on? And the other is, if those aspirations are not met, what is the implications for society? And there, especially if you put that together with the current political climate and the building up of social tensions,
Yeah.
then you have quite a deadly kind of combination of
Yeah.
factors, where out of work men, men who are not happy with their situation in life, aspirations are not being met, whose anger is being redirected
Yeah.
in unproductive ways,
Yeah.
society can pay a very big price for that. I think we already are in some
Yeah.
ways, but it can definitely get a lot worse before it gets better, if we don't have a coherent policy approach to creating gainful and productive employment, which is aspirational also. I mean, we're not
Yeah.
talking just about putting people to work anyhow, which anyway they will do, as I said. At
Yeah.
some point they are going to end up doing something, but
Yeah.
that's not what we want. We want them to do something that they feel fulfilled, and that they would like to do.
I'll just come. We'll come back to the policy implications and all that stuff in just a minute. I wanted to ask you a question. Like, our problems with creating jobs are obviously we have a big problem there. But what about the jobs that we are creating? Are we creating in terms of the quality of the jobs and the wages? Are we creating long-term secure employment with benefits, or are we moving? I know in the last report you mentioned that COVID had pushed the job creation in directions of informality and casual labor and short-term labor. Like we are we even not getting the whatever jobs we are creating? Are we not even getting those right?
Yes, I think that is fair to say, and that connects back to this sort of rush for public employment or government employment that we
Yeah.
were discussing earlier.
Yeah.
That it's the absence of well-paying and secure jobs in the private sector that makes people even hungrier
Yeah.
for government jobs, because those are much more secure and much better paying.
Yeah.
In fact, doing the same kind of work in the public versus private sector pays very different kinds of
Yeah.
money. Right? So
Yeah.
you know that there is a problem there. Now the question is, why is the private sector offering the kind of bad quality employment that it is offering?
Yeah.
And here it actually connects back to job creation,
Yeah.
because a job is only as good as the worker's capacity to demand a good job. If
Okay.
there are many, many workers for very few jobs, then they are forced to take what is offered.
Yeah.
And employers are not going to go out of their way to make a job good for you if they don't need to.
Yeah.
It is the nature of capitalism that
True.
employers will always try to minimize costs. So
True.
it's the increase in the bargaining position of the worker that has historically improved
Improved
employment
working. Yeah,
conditions.
that's true.
Okay? Laws can help, but laws cannot make it happen on their own.
We know that very well. Here in India, we have so many labor laws, which don't
Exactly.
never really
Right?
did anything. Yeah.
So, in the presence of surplus labor, in the
Yeah.
presence of a huge number of people willing to work in very, very risky, undignified kind of work environments, laws will not help. But what will help is robust job creation,
Yeah.
which will force the private employers to start offering decent work, And I know I often say this to people who ask this question about security of jobs, right? That it's not necessary, at least in a capitalist economy, that you have some sort of a tenured, safe from firing kind of job to feel secure. You might even feel secure if you know that if I were to lose this job, there are other jobs that are available for me. Right? It's not the end of the world to
True.
lose a job. In a couple of months, in a month, I'll find another job.
True.
That is a different kind of security. We are not used to thinking of that as
Yeah.
security. We think of it as, but that's a legitimate way. And again, when jobs are being created in a healthy economy, that's what you will have. That you might lose one job for some reason, but you'll find another job.
True. 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 So coming back to this question of what, like, this crisis that we have at our hands, what can be done about it? How can we go about it? Is it mostly government led? Is it how does the private sector help in it? What can be done about it? That's the
Yeah, I think this is obviously the kind of most important question
yeah.
facing us, and your viewers will not be surprised to learn that it's a very complicated, multi-dimensional problem, because we have
Absolutely.
cultural norms in the mix. We have
Yeah.
caste and gender norm type of issues, all the way to the global economy issues,
True.
because a lot of our difficulties in job creation and jobless growth are not peculiar to us.
True.
Many developing countries are facing the same problems. So it's not easy to solve this problem, but nevertheless, we can point to at least a few
Yeah.
uh, types of solutions.
Okay.
So we can think of it as broadly what the government can do and what the private sector is going to do.
Okay.
Right? Nobody expects that India's job problem will be solved by the government, meaning that government cannot hire everybody who wants
Yeah.
to work, but it can nevertheless create conditions in which the private sector is able to create jobs. So there's a part of the solution which lies in the government hiring on its own, a
Yeah.
small part of the solution, because
Yeah.
India is not, contrary to popular belief, it
Yeah.
doesn't have
Yeah.
a huge government sector.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
We in
Yeah.
fact have fewer public servants per 1,000 people than many other countries.
Absolutely.
We don't have enough doctors, we don't have enough nurses, we don't have enough teachers. So there's a lot of public employment possibilities in the care sector, health sector,
Yeah.
education sector,
Yeah.
which will create jobs directly.
Yeah.
And we should not lose sight of that.
Yeah.
But that cannot be the only solution, which brings us to the much more tricky part of how do we incentivize the private sector? How do we make it possible to create jobs?
Yeah.
There are certain global aspects of automation and globalization that
Yeah.
are very difficult to manage from any country.
Yeah.
Because we're talking about trade and industrial policy type of issues.
Yeah.
We're talking about being export competitive in the face of many other countries that are far better than us at infrastructure
Yeah.
and business climate. So part of the solution is about improving local infrastructure for small businesses. A lot of job creation happens in small firms,
Yeah.
and there are millions of small firms,
Yeah.
but they face very simple constraints like inadequate electricity,
Yeah.
interrupted power supply, not good roads
Yeah.
enough to get goods to the market, basic stuff,
Yeah.
which many other countries have solved much better than us.
Yeah.
So paying attention to local infrastructure and creating a much more enabling regulatory environment for small businesses. So I'm using words such as enabling regulatory environment because we don't want a deregulated free for all system, but we want people to feel that the government is there to solve the problems that they face if they play by certain rules.
Okay.
And those rules could include employment conditions, minimum wages. So it's a social pact, right, between the
Got it.
government and the entrepreneur,
Yes.
that
Yes.
you do these basic things that you should be doing,
Yeah.
and in return I will make your life easy for you.
Yeah. Okay.
I will help you to expand and so forth. I think this is where we are really not quite there. A lot of mistrust is there both ways.
Yeah.
The government mistrusts entrepreneurs,
Yeah.
and entrepreneurs mistrust government. And we get stuck in this very bad situation where this mutual mistrust means that people are continuously trying to cheat the system,
Yeah.
while the government is trying to catch them cheating it. And so it makes a lot of these laws and regulations and so forth.
Yeah.
How to move to a trustworthy or trusting equilibrium is a very difficult problem to solve, as you can
Yeah.
imagine. It's like caste or gender. It's
True.
rooted in the culture.
Yeah.
But I'm bringing it up because viewers need to think about these issues and how do we actually solve them. So so it's a gamut from industrial and trade policy and export competitiveness to growth of small firms to increasing public employment to provide critical needed infrastructure. All of this has to be part of the solution.
Jumping from the sort of academic question so far to a little bit of a political question, if you don't mind that, how do you sort of assess so far all the the reactions and the policies of central and state governments, if they have taken any, in dealing with this problem, the problem of employment? How do you rate their performance so far?
I mean, that's a huge. So, do you mean in the past 2 years, or what time
Let's
frame
say
are we talking?
after COVID, like when the problem started becoming really acute, you know.
Right. Well, that is difficult because it's very fresh, right? I mean, the COVID
Okay.
shock was so big
Yeah.
that I think it's hard to tell, whether any policies are helpful in that respect.
Okay.
But if you look a little bit a little bit
Okay.
longer, like
Okay.
of past few years,
Okay.
we have definitely not done all that we can do either at the central or the state level.
Hmm.
The noises are there. I think all the governments at the central state level know that this is an important issue, but sometimes we get a little sidetracked. We have, for example, ideas like jobs for locals that many state governments have tried to do, right?
I
Even
always thought
after
that was a
COVID.
great symptom, right? Because you just like, how can I solve this problem in the most simplest way? Is like, okay, we don't have enough jobs, only jobs for locals.
Correct, right, and that's not going to work.
Yeah.
So it's a kind of a policy that could be popular in an
Yeah.
electoral sense, but
Yeah. Yeah.
economically, it's not going to solve the problem.
Yeah.
There have been other more imaginative solutions that states have tried. So I don't know how well they have worked, but many states have tried this. In fact, even the central government has tried that. It gives an incentive to employers based on workers hired, either through paying their PF contribution or
Yeah.
something else.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like the Rozgar Protsahan Yojana, for example, is that kind.
Hmm. Hmm.
So the government says, if you hire more workers, we will waive the
Yeah.
PF for
Yeah.
so many years. But what we don't know is when that policy finishes, do those workers remain?
Hmm.
Or do employers get rid of them? Is there a sustainable way of increasing jobs or not? We don't know that.
True.
But there's definitely a lot of scope for creative thinking here because traditional policies are not working. If you think that we are just going to increase growth
Yeah.
somehow
Yeah.
and that will increase jobs, that's not happening.
You've I don't know how much do you think that this is like a long-term solution, but you've sort of also advocated not just for the expansion of the like the number of work days allowed under Narega, but also like creation of an urban employment guarantee scheme. Is that like a long-term solution, do you think, or is it just to get over this like really acutely bad period?
That's a good question. It can certainly be thought of as an emergency
Yeah.
measure for sure, and many state governments did think of it that way. That they have done it. Odisha, Jharkhand,
Hmm.
Tamil Nadu recently, Rajasthan. Several of them have done it, but I don't think it is necessary to think of it as a super short-term emergency. You can think of it as a slightly longer-term program which will help do two or three things. It will help create a safety net in urban areas
Yeah.
for casual workers who will have a fallback option.
Yeah.
It will generate that local infrastructure that I was talking about that
Yeah.
is missing in many of our smaller towns.
Yeah.
And it might even put some new life into small town ULBs, urban local bodies, which are really severely cash strapped and finance constrained. Might put some life into them too. So, because we know Mandega, for example, empowered panchayats,
Yeah.
it created rural infrastructure and so
Yeah.
forth.
Yeah.
Urban green jobs can be created through this. We can do some ecological restoration of urban spaces. So there are some good things that will come out of an urban employment program over the medium run. Of course, over the very long run, we don't want either Narega or such a program to be there because we want people to have their own
Yeah.
sources of employment. Right? So that remains, but
Okay.
that's a decade long or a few decades long scenario. In the meantime, I think such a program at the national level
Yeah.
could do many things.
Okay. Just I wanted to play like a little bit of a devil's advocate. Okay. I would say that whatever this problem in the whatever global and like local sort of macroeconomic factors are leading to this problem that the private sector is not able to create jobs, we just let it run its course. Maybe just like the boom phase of 2004-5, maybe once there's a new equilibrium, the market reaches an equilibrium, leave it to the market. Maybe there's another phase of growth and it will absorb all the people who have entered the job market. how likely do you think is that scenario going to play out?
See, there are two parts to this. One is the growth part, and there I think it's quite reasonable to say that growth may return. Right? We are going through a low growth phase.
Yeah.
COVID hit, so many
Yeah.
things happened.
Yeah.
From 2016 to 2021, we've had multiple shocks.
Yeah.
Growth may go back.
Yeah.
Right. The question is, will job creation happen
Yeah.
correspondingly or not? And I
Okay.
think there I'm much less sanguine, that we just need to wait it out, because
Yeah.
it, even in the past, it's not like we had a hugely successful,
Yeah.
the period that we are calling successful. What did it do? It
Yeah.
basically replaced precarious rural livelihoods with precarious
Yes.
urban
Oh, yeah.
livelihoods.
Yeah.
We didn't move to more productive jobs.
True.
All of that didn't happen. The growth came from finance,
Yeah.
from capital intensive manufacturing, from IT BPO,
Yeah.
sectors that did not create jobs.
Yeah.
That's where the growth came from.
Yeah.
And it can come back again too,
Again.
possibly, but the jobs won't come there. So we know that the jobs problem is a much deeper problem that we cannot wait for it to be
Yeah.
solved by market mechanisms. We have to do something actively for it.
And just the last question, sir. If we do not like try to solve this problem with as much vigor and just like, because it is a huge social concern, what kind of like long, if yeah, we go into a growth phase but the job creation doesn't pick up and stuff like that, this weird combination of like falling employment and high unemployment rates, the recent, like in the current period there's high inflation, like if we don't address this problem, what kind of future are we looking at, just both in terms of at the household level, in what happens to people in their lives, and sort of macroeconomic level, what kind of things can happen?
This is anybody's guess. I don't have any special authority on this, and it also depends to an extent on whether you are inherently an optimist or a pessimist at heart. Right? So
Let's try to be
I'm an
optimistic.
optimist at
Yeah,
heart.
yeah,
Yeah.
same.
So,
Let's try to be
so I'm
optimistic.
an optimist at heart. So I don't think that we will. I mean, I don't think in terms of doomsday scenarios. They are serious problems, and we are seeing a buildup of social tensions along all kinds of dimensions,
Yeah.
religious, caste,
Yeah.
and so on. So we can have backlashes, and when growth gets bad, people turn on each other, they try to blame each other. We've seen all this in many countries.
Yeah.
So I don't want to underplay these risks
Yeah.
by any means. We could
Yeah.
be heading for very dark times,
Yeah.
genuinely.
Yeah.
And in fact, Indians, I would say, have not seen the kind of uh, disasters that have befallen Europe and other countries. Right? They've been through some extremely dark periods
Yeah.
in the history. We only see them now in their prosperous phase.
Yeah.
But Europeans were at each other's throats within their country, with other countries for decades, and they
Yeah, yeah.
basically destroyed their countries
Yep.
in the process.
Yeah.
We don't want that. We
Yeah.
don't want that replicated here. So, and we still have the chance to
Yeah.
not do that.
Yeah.
And I think the economic aspect is a very important aspect of it, because in all of these two, fascism and all of these other aspects, war, economic depressions and problems were always part of the mix,
Yep.
even if they were not the only reason for
Yeah.
it. So I would say that we should remain optimistic and think that we can solve these problems.
Yeah.
However, that cannot happen by just hoping that good times will return, or something like that. What is needed at the policy level, state and central, is an acknowledgement that mere growth focus is not enough, and active employment focus is needed.
Yeah.
And to acknowledge that the growth in consumption and so on cannot be taken as a indicator that all is well. I'm mentioning this specifically because we've seen many episodes of debt finance, consumption, and so on in other countries, right, where people are buying things, they feel that they are doing better, but actually the fundamentals are not there.
Yeah.
They don't have well-paying jobs and so on. Things can go bad very quickly. So we should be looking at things like wages, job security, and so forth, much more than how many people have mobile phones.
Absolutely.
How many people have smartphones, stuff like that.
Absolutely.
But I think the bottom line is that the moment has not passed. We should not be giving up on
No,
anything.
absolutely.
But we need to work hard at a better future.